Folks, welcome to a special edition of the Jake Feinberg Show. And since the inception of my show, I have wanted to preach inclusivity as opposed to castigation. Find leaders that led by love, trust, and a formal commitment to keep growing. These individuals weren't born this way. They grew into themselves by acknowledging that they are first not perfect. But what they had to offer was full of soul, authenticity, and truth through the language of Black American music. Billy Hart, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thanks for having me.
It's an honor, my friend. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a guy in jazz history that he doesn't get a lot of press these days, but I wanted you to talk a little bit about your relationship with Monk Montgomery.
It's hard to know where to start. Monk was a very friendly person, but again, like you talked about, out of love, because he was very philosophical in his friendliness. He just wanted to help people, and it was because of our friendship that he actually recommended me to join his brother's band, Wes Montgomery.
Right.
So I remained in Wes's band until he died. In fact, we were all pallbearers at Wes's funeral. But I wouldn't call Monk a comedian. I mean, he wasn't the kind of guy that just liked to tell jokes. In fact, he didn't tell jokes, but he just saw the humor in everything.
Right.
And of course, he was an original, because as far as I know, he was the first guy to ever really perform consistently on the electric bass.
Absolutely, you're right about that.
And that's what I know about him, and that he was, he was obviously very, very kind to me, and very friendly. And I met him on the road. I think he might have been playing with Cal Jada or somebody like that in those days, because they were all living in California, or at least Monk and Buddy.
Yeah, when I went out to California to promote a concert of My Heroes in Black Jazz, a little label that Gene Russell owned for a while, and Carl Burnett talked about Monk Montgomery. Almost, he was just the kind of person who he just was trying to always make people wiser around him while always staying strong, always staying real strong. And at 33 years old, Billy, I'm trying to, I look at my vinyl collection, I look at the guys on the labels, and I say to myself, it was a very different time. The idea that they had George Shearing on an album with the Montgomery brothers. This idea of multiracial music was accepted by the establishment. And I just wonder, how did we get, where did that come from? Can you describe that path a little bit?
Well, I don't know that much about it, but certainly American music has contributors of all the nationalities that were here. So, although George was British,
right?
But the respect and the love for the music attracts people as far as I can see. At least the musicians. Those were the times. I mean, for me, it was the time of just, when electronic pop music was just beginning. So I saw, I had occasion to hang out with Jimi Hendrix and his band, as well as Tower of Power, David Garibaldi.
Oh, yeah.
Chicago.
Yeah.
And all those guys, while playing with Herbie Hancock and McCoy Tyner.
Oh.
It just didn't seem that be that much of a separation in those days.
The more, yeah, go ahead.
Me.
Continue.
And certainly George, is one of the premier bop composers, as well as a formidable pianist, jazz pianist. But I mean, just that one tune conception is I'm still playing that with my band today.
It was the idea. It was not to jump too far ahead, but there was also like this idea of promotion as well. The idea that you might put Tower of Power, Jimi Hendrix and Malo all on the same bill, so you'd have Chicano, black, and white people all showing up at the same concert. It was more of a collectivist thing. It wasn't this separation or demagoguing of people based on race. Not from the music,
I know exactly your perception of that, but certainly if that was the case or is the case, and I can see it at least beginning around the time that Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker started embracing Afro-Caribbean music themselves. That seemed to bring those two cultures together, and we're still benefiting by that today. By the different guys between, say, Herbie Hancock to Milton Nascimento to Daniel Perez to Eddie Palmieri, Tito Puente, on and on and on.
Chano Pozo, Warren Smith, Billy Hart, Joe Chambers, Max Roach, right? That's it.
Yeah, Dizzy and Bird,
right.
By embracing Afro-Caribbean music, it became part of our normal vocabulary. When I think about composing my own songs, I don't even feel like I'm borrowing from those guys anymore. I think I'm so familiar with it that I feel like it's part of my language also.
You become very fluent in that language.
Well, I hope so. I'm fluent in my love of that language and that music.
I have to go back for a minute. Yeah, I have to go back for a minute. You were born in D.C. How did you wind up in the soul circuit? How did that transpire?
Well, there were, let me think, 4 theaters. The Howard Theater in Washington, D.C., the Royal Theater in Baltimore, the Uptown Theater in Philadelphia, the Regal Theater in Chicago, and the Apollo Theater in Harlem, New York. And that was a circuit, and architecturally, all those theaters looked almost identical. And I first started going to those theaters when my parents took me there, to see Duke Ellington, Count Basie and stuff. But later, by the time I started performing there, I actually performed there either opposite or sometimes even with the Isley Brothers, Joe Tex, Sam and Dave, Otis Redding, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells, and so forth and so on. So, just being from Washington, D.C., where a lot of those acts in those days didn't bring their own bands. And I was the house drummer for a short period of time at the Howard Theater, at the big band. So I was privy to that information. I mean, just to see the innovations that were coming out of that system. And of course, that helped me a lot when Jimmy Smith and Wes Montgomery began to go more in that direction.
What was it about what was it about? I like how you what was it about the venues that provided an intimacy for that soul music? There was so much power, energy, and love, and and those venues played a role, did they not?
Oh well, it was the primary Afro-American theaters in the neighborhoods. When a lot of the times there was a very subtle segregation. All of these theaters were basically in Afro-American neighborhoods.
So there was but I mean,
that gave it a certain power in itself. I mean, it was a spirit of music that although it was new, it was a tradition. It came from a tradition and Afro-American music and the neighborhoods that we recognized,
right,
and enjoyed,
right.
So I mean, it was James Brown and his Otis Redding, but certainly parts of that was Duke Ellington and Count Basie, and also
So when were the years that you were with Sam and Dave and Otis? Was it in the 50s or?
Well, I was basically playing at the Howard Theater when I would play with them.
Oh, I see.
Because I was the house drummer.
I see. So I mean,
and then occasionally if they did something local, of course I went so far as to go to Boston and play with the Isley Brothers one time, and then you had those Maryland beaches. I think that's when I played with Patti LaBelle a lot. In fact, come to think of it, I also played with Sam Cooke and Jackie Wilson in one of those beaches. I was just there, I was just around, I was a guy that wanted to play, just play music, and that was my immediate environment. And plus to say nothing of the great improvising musicians that were there.
So
like Buck Hill and those guys, Shirley Horn. And
I wonder sometimes, as I've talked to many of my heroes in music, whether our history books say that desegregation was a really good thing, or was there validity in the black neighborhoods, the fully?
Oh, forgive me for coughing.
That's fine. What I'm trying to say is, a lot of the guys talk about.
I'm sorry. Go on.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Go on.
It's fine. A lot of the cats talk about. They knew what bus stop to get off at. They if they were cutting up in the neighborhood, the neighbors would be on them before their parents would. But it gave the kids the idea that people cared about them. And when we desegregated that, the neighborhoods lost some of that loyalty, some of that camaraderie. I mean, it's the case for all ethnic neighborhoods. But when I look back on desegregation, I say, boy, was that the best thing for? I mean, I look at it and I say, my gosh, we had Curtis Mayfield and Donny Hathaway and all Otis Redding. I mean, their messages were powerful, real powerful about looking to the future, love through and strength through like inclusivity, not ostracizing people, not separating people. And that must have come from just, like you said, these venues in black neighborhoods, black musicians coming to these neighborhoods. I'd love to get your take on that.
Well, I just said it. That's exactly what I said. And you said it too. I mean, obviously, I grew up and played mostly in Afro-American neighborhoods, even in Washington, D.C. I mean, there was an incredible scene, even though this was this subtle segregation. But then I also came up in a time just as communities were getting to be more integrated. After World War II, this country had so much money that there was a whole new budding era of liberalism that was developing. And then of course, although Washington, D.C. was late, but they integrated the high schools when I was in high school. My first year in high school was the year that that they integrated the schools.
And what was that? Yeah, go ahead.
So you begin to have a youthful perspective politically, because you realize that these people didn't necessarily have any more than you had, or know any more than you knew. Where at a certain point you assumed that something else was going on, because it seemed like they had everything. But then you find out that was my first indication that there was, or what Eisenhower might have been meant when he said, beware of the military-industrial complexes, something like that, right?
Well, could you explain? I can't quite see I know that line very well, but how does it relate to the desegregation of the school?
Well, it didn't mean that much to me until I realized that, when they say that it was an Afro-American revolution in the late 50s all the way through the early 70s,
right,
it seems more to me that it was more a youth revolution, a youth awareness of who we were. In other words, it's the first time we were in each other's company enough to discuss things spiritually, philosophically, materially, politically. Because when you had all that Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and SNCC and all of that, you also had a lot of white kids that were killed.
Right. Because they knew fundamentally they could see, they could actually visually see with their own visual sense the prejudice. Whereas today, Well, but you say prejudice, but I guess you could call it. Prejudice is a fact, but a lot of people, what I'm trying to say is, once we were aware of each other, there was less. It was an immediate less prejudice. Right.
You had to know somebody. Say, oh wow, So it was just that. It was just a separation, and once we began to get closer and closer, it was less of that. At least, so it seemed during my youth, during my high school and college and young adult years, that revelation was exciting. Just the mix, and you begin to have even more mixed bands and more mixed social situations.
Really?
It seemed to happen, and then something happened. When things began to turn around, and I guess between all these different wars and stuff, and of course the escalation of capitalism. After World War II, people got used to having more money, or wanting more money, or desiring more. Where we all seem to be a little more satisfied with what we had then, at least as young people, anyway.
Well, I really like the way you frame that. We're talking to drummer Billy Hart, and when I talked to Eddie Henderson, it was and I've done over 130 interviews, Billy. I've covered both coasts, your generation, a little bit younger, but right in that same range. Eddie Henderson was the first guy that I really felt that some of the stories that he told me were not of this world. It was really otherworldly, and one of them was this, the way he described Mwadishi, the coming together of him in the band, and then how the music changed. And without giving away what he said, I'd kind of like to get your take on being in that band with Johnny Coles and Julian Priester, and then when it switched over to Eddie, and you guys started to fundamentally change the sound.
Well, that's a fact, and it seemed to happen It seemed to happen so naturally and so quickly, we almost weren't aware that it was happening. And I just think that Herbie Hancock is that special a person. I think he truly is one of the real visionaries of my era. However that came about. I mean, he could, and he could. Through him, we could realize the possibilities of the future. He really had digested more than most, at least for me, the Afro-Caribbean music, not only rhythmically, which most people miss if they're not drummers, but harmonically too, because he also played with the Brazilians. I mean, he started out playing with Mongo Santa Maria and Tito Puente and
Willie Bobo
and Willie Bobo and those guys. But he also was playing with Milton Nascimento and Ayrton and a lot of the Brazilian guys also, and so he was able to see all of that possibility. In other words, a second generation viewpoint there to Charlie Parker and Machito and the trumpet player. I can't think of his name now. The Afro-Cuban.
I can't help you on this one.
It'll come back to me. I want to say Bauer, but it wasn't Bauer.
Don't worry. Just keep going.
Yeah. Anyway, but Herbie realized all that, and the relationship that had with the dance music of the day, and through that he could see the dance music of the future, which of course you hear him on, anybody from, Stevie Wonder to the Pointer Sisters. I mean, I don't know how many people know that he's on a lot of those records, but I mean, he just had that vision of American music, the future of American music, to say nothing of his mastery of European classical music.
I'm trying my best to, get inside. Like I asked Eddie, I said, when you guys were that tight, I mean, with Buster and Benny and you and Eddie and Herbie, and you're on the road for a month, I said, is there any room for any type of domestic relationship at all? And he said, no way. I mean, there was just, it was so unbelievable. It was a different, it was just totally spiritual. So is it, looking back on it, is there a way to put it into any kind of, could you describe like turning the corner, or it just happened and the next thing you knew you were just doing it?
Well, I'll give you an example. Eddie was a doctor, and more than just a doctor. I mean, he had done his 4 years of pre-med, his 2.5 years of med school, and then I forget what you call it, internship, and then he went into psychiatry also. So when we saw him, when we saw him in California, he was a psychiatrist. He was in the clinic with Denny Zeitlin out there, and I guess he told you the story when a couple of times he actually had to, when Thelonious Monk was incarcerated, he was in charge of Thelonious Monk for a couple of days.
Oh no, he didn't tell me that.
Anyway, so he came to take Woody Shaw's place with the band just for the weekend,
right? Because
Woody left to go with Joe Henderson. So since I had known Eddie Henderson, because he went to med school at Howard University, since I knew him in Washington D.C., I said, well, Eddie, if you were just a regular trumpet player on the scene, you sound so good, you probably would have a chance for this gig. He said, man, I've already hit on Herbie for the gig. And I said, you did what? After 7 years of studying him, and you had 3 days with this band, and all of a sudden you want to leave that? I said, well, what about all those years with medicine? He said, man, the heck with it. This is what. And when we left San Francisco, he left with us. So that was a very powerful endorsement as far as I was concerned. So when we got to the next gig was in Canada, I guess it was Vancouver. Julian Priester joined the band because Herbie was beginning to work more than the previous trombone player, who was a studio musician. He didn't want to give up his studio work.
Was Garnett Brown?
Garnett Brown.
Yeah.
So he left the band, and Julian Priester came in and Vancouver. So right away, that's a difference. Eddie Henderson had one of the premier medical doctor gigs in this country, and he gave it up after 3 days. And this guy that was already a musician and a studio musician on it couldn't go on. He was already playing music, and he stopped. He couldn't go on with the band. So anyway, Julian Priester joined the band, and immediately Julian's experience. He was older than most of us, and he began to add his professionalism. So before we left Vancouver, I personally began to notice a kind of, what can you call it, telepathic thing that was beginning to occur that I had never experienced before. So I remember Benny Maupin coming over to me while the music was being played, and he said, "Man, did you hear that?" and I said, "Yeah, I heard that, but I thought you New York guys, because I was a little new to New York at the time. I thought maybe that's what you guys do." Right. And he said, "No, man, I've never experienced that before." And that began to go on in conversation. Julian Priester came over to me again while the music was going on and said something similar. So then we began to realize at that point that this thing was going on. And we were talking among ourselves. Nobody thought to ask Herbie about it, but we were definitely talking. Within 2 or 3 days, we began to talk about this thing that we had noticed. And
you guys must
have went from there. It just went from there.
Were you in awe of it? Would you laugh about it? That to me.
Well, yeah. It was, of course it was euphoric.
Yeah.
But it was also philosophical and spiritual, and it seemed to relate to the fact that we were all around the same age, and that we were all, relating also to the so-called Afro-American Revolution or movement that was going on at the time. So all of that was mixed in it, and that's how we all ended up getting our Swahili names.
Jabali.
And the thing, that's how that all of that began to, and then we became these apostles. Everywhere we went, we would, besides giving the people the music, we would also give them this sort of cultural kind of attitude, and it was, in its own way, it was sort of sophisticated, because it related to knowing a little more about your history, politically as well as musically, culturally and everything, because all of that was going on at the same time.
I was going to say, again, going back to a couple things you said, Eddie told the classic story. He said the reason I didn't go into gynecology or be a pediatrician is because that he was on call once every 2 days. Psychiatry was once every 45 days. So he could get his chops up playing. He could go to school, he could come home and study, then he'd go out and play jazz at night. And that was pre-Mwadishi. But that speaks to, that's a great story. I mean, the point is that, and the other thing I was going to say is that the money today is so, it's too much, especially in the music industry. And to me, it saps, like, the reason you were curious and politically aware was because you were searching and you weren't on some 35, Prince Fielder signs with the Detroit Tigers for $35 million. I don't know how I'm supposed to even relate to us. That's what I used to be, a big sports fan. And I used to do baseball on the radio, when I first got out of college. But I can't relate to the athlete of today because of the money. Whereas you guys as a spiritual tribe, that to me is what's lacking, is the soul. The body of the American car is strong. There's no soul. And that's where a band like yours is. And it's the quality of the person and the selflessness. I mean, Eddie said you guys all took $300. Did the Realization album at Dr. Patrick Gleason's house, and that was that. I mean, it was just ridiculous.
Well, yeah, things were, of course, a lot cheaper then also. But the whole point was that that we were dealing with not just that, but a technological revolution that meant people could play for larger and larger audiences. So the people that were in charge of the business, in other words, we were musicians and excited about the music, but there were people that were excited about the music business that weren't musicians.
Right.
And they saw playing for all of these people as something to desire. And so they were constantly trying to convince us to do that, to play for a wider audience. They wanted more people to hear the music. And of course, if more people heard the music according to them, then of course we would be compensated more. So certainly that would, nobody was going to turn that down.
That's true, but then
was a
right.
chance of some kind of confusion, conceptual confusion with that, that it, you didn't really, you didn't think about the fact that you couldn't have both, or that you would, what you gain, you lose,
right.
Whatever you lose, you gain, or something like that. And nobody had time to think about that then, because still at that point the music was still being innovated at a very high level, because a lot of that stuff, of course, had come from John Coltrane, and Ornette Coleman. They had very high philosophical relationships to their music that we adopted.
You mentioned before that that you're currently teaching at 3 different universities, and aside from technique, how do you try to mentor? What are the things you do to mentor your students aside from the technique?
Well, just what we're talking about now. There's certain spiritual, or let's call it philosophical, experience that I've had that I think benefit my musical direction. That I think is something that they, because they seem to want to know what it is about my playing. They want me to describe something in my playing that you can't describe just by academics.
Mm-hmm.
So usually I end up talking about philosophical kinds of things that I learned from being around people like Coltrane and Ornette, and there's people like that, and there, Sam Rivers, just guys that were beyond genius,
Right. The men themselves were, they were larger than life in some ways. Although,
yeah,
I wanted to ask
and
you.
they related to it like that. I mean, Coltrane had a concept of God that he called love.
Right.
Love supreme.
Right.
And then he started talking about attainment of it. That it was a process of attainment. That's something that you work towards that gave you health. A certain kind of it was healthy to work towards that kind of a goal. And so you sort of I sort of try to give the students that kind of concept, that you're not working just to achieve a certain amount of academic talent,
proficiency, yeah.
Yeah, so but that you also want to raise the consciousness of the people that you're performing for.
How do you make inroads for someone like myself, passionate radio show host, seeing my idols, my leaders in you guys? I mean, when you talk about your students now and juxtapose that to the idea of Julian Priester coming up to you and saying, "Did you hear that?" And you're like, "I didn't know that was coming, but I felt," the point is you had accessibility in live venues. Every urban center in this country, from Houston to Chicago, New York to San Francisco, they all had 5 or 6 venues that may or may not house jazz, but you would still go there and wind up there for long periods of time so you could get loose in a live setting, and you can pass these stories on. But for a musician, I'd say that they got to learn that up on the bandstand. But how do they do that if there's a lack of access? How do you break through that, if at all?
Right. Well, that's something that a lot of the guys of my generation that are in a teaching situation, we have that discussion a lot of the time. And all we can do is try to be as articulate as possible. And it isn't that easy, because you're talking to a different world.
I know. Here's the thing. I am so versed in this stuff that I promote record players, East Village, and I also promote somehow getting into the inner cities of this country and finding if there are any cats at all that are even picking up instruments at all. I'm sure there's plenty of sampling going on. I'm sure there's plenty of people comping beats. They do, but are there bands in the inner cities? I mean, that's where you got to find the hunger, the people that are hungry. It's as far as I'm concerned. I don't know. I would love to be part of this coalition because, well, I already am in a lot of ways, but I want to be able to push to a progressive future for my kids. For my daughters, they're both going to be thespians. They're both in theater, and I mean, I'm looking for authenticity, and I feel like the minute that our establishment now, in whether it's academia, politics, they sniff authenticity, and that's scary. And it's kind of like that has to come back first, and that talks about the content of people's character. I didn't mean to get too deep, but I'm just sort of going off on that.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, you have to be aware. I mean, your daughters will benefit just from your awareness. You know what I mean? And they'll seek out other people that have that kind of awareness. And a lot of it just seems to be knowing more about your history. They say the people that don't know their history are the ones that are most doomed to repeat it. The mistakes or whatever.
Right. Well, but then there's also a thing about
You've got because it goes back. You talk to certain people, like if you talk to Farrakhan, the black Muslim minister.
Yeah.
He'll say things like Allah created everything, but he brought music with him. And then you'll hear something. I just saw something just today by Einstein, and he said something like how did he put it? Oh boy, I wish I could find it.
It sounds.
He put imagination far above. I don't know if he called it wisdom, but something. But he put imagination was the highest thing.
Wow, that's awesome. I would love to get that full text of that. That's cool.
Yeah. So you keep finding people that say things like that. Like they asked Coltrane one time. They said, "Mr. Coltrane, what are you trying to do with your music?" Because they thought he was relating it more to what they thought was the Afro-American Revolution of the 60s.
Sure.
And he changed their minds because he said, "I simply want to be a force for good. I simply want to be a force for good." And they said, "Well, wait a minute." He said, "Well, what do you think about classical music?" And he said, "Please correct me if I'm wrong, but every culture on the planet has a classical music. To which culture are you referring?" You know what I'm saying? I mean, the point is that North America has a classical music that nobody refers to it. They just refer to it as some evolution, which it is, an evolution of folk music, of dance music or something, improvised music. But it's definitely according to the terms of where all the other classical musics came from. Ours comes just as honestly as that. It was originally dance music, and it evolved into this, whatever you want to call it today. So the point is, when do you begin to slow down your dancing part and do more listening, or slow down the listening part and do more dancing, or when you're just listening, are you also dancing without moving, or something? Just those kinds of things.
Well, that quote right there is one for the record books, Billy. I love that. That's what it is. It's a consciousness shift. It's the ability to say, all right, a little too much of the digital, too much digitization, and not. I mean, I guess the one thing I love about Mwadishi, there's something. It's a question too. The music industry after '75, especially with jazz, it seemed to say, okay, we need to be conservative. Let's play close to the vest. Let's do the Richard Rodgers songbooks. Let's do Rodgers and Hammerstein. You look at the labels, they started to shrink up, and people started playing very safe, conventional stuff that would sell. The thing about Mwadishi was, you guys were creating a completely cosmic sound. And at some point, when did the music industry pivot and say, no, we're done exploring. We're just out to make money? When did you start?
But it wasn't just the music industry; it was the whole country.
Thank you.
I mean, if you think it was some kind of setback in terms of the music industry, look where we are now politically.
Exactly. Okay.
I mean, that's a clear reflection of what we're talking about. It isn't just the music industry that had that happen. The whole country is in collapse because of that.
Can we be? What can you point to some specifics of that? I'm with you. I feel you.
Well, I mean, I'm just saying. When you say capitalism, basically, what it means to me is marketing is basically you find something that has a certain amount of value, and you decrease the quality to have more of a profit motive. In other words, whatever the size of whatever it is you're selling, you dilute some of it. You dilute some of the quality. In other words, you can sell twice the amount. I mean, you can sell one half of the amount for the same price. In other words, it's why can't I say it? I don't know how to say it, but you decrease the quality for quantity.
Exactly.
And so that's what's happening. Meanwhile, you take somebody like M1DC or Herbie Hancock, whatever you want to call him. He saw all of that. It's like he saw all of that, and I haven't talked to him personally in many years, but I heard from some people that he was very disappointed in the philosophy of the industry, yet he has benefited by it almost more than anybody else. I mean, there's only two instrumentalists in the history of the Grammys that actually won the Grammys, not like the Jazz Grammy, but won the Grammy. And Herbie is only the second one that ever did that. So he's benefited. So what I think is that he is intelligent enough to keep. If they say, look, man, all you can do, all we're going to allow you to do is play a commercial style of music, then it seems like he has just raised the quality of commercial style music.
Right. So it's the total package, because you need to have the person who's equipped with the depth of musical talent.
Yes.
To be able to play something scintillating that would otherwise be just white bread,
Right, exactly, and the quality of it is so high. I mean, I can't say enough about him as a social genius. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, philosophically, he should be president of the United States.
Exactly.
I mean, maybe he doesn't know enough about. He doesn't. He's not a sophisticated politician as we know it. But in terms of I think of him as a what can you say? Somebody that I think of him as a spiritual leader. I really do. I think he's a spiritual leader. Not unlike Coltrane. I just think what can I? There's a word for that. Somebody that really cares about people, that cares about the human race. What you know what I'm saying? What do you call?
Well, I mean, I go back to I go back to the comment you said about Coltrane when they were kind of questioning him about his music, and he said, "I'm doing it for love." I'm doing it. He was able to say it in such clear language. Everything now.
Well, I think Herbie's like that. I think he really cares about uplifting the social fabric. I think he wants to uplift people with his music, with his talent. I think he wants. I wish I could think of the word that I'm looking for people that do that.
I mean,
what was Gandhi? What was Martin Luther King? I mean, I just think Herbie really, while benefiting, I think he could, if he just wanted to make a whole lot of money, he could have made a lot more money than he's made, even though he must be comfortable. but I think he makes sure that he's given the people something of extremely high quality. And I think you have to be a special person to care that much, and to know that's what, to have worked on it, to the point where you can be successful at it, like he is.
Right, and secure enough and focused enough to know what your values are, and not be corrupted by the insatiable desire for the amount of money. But Billy Hart, I know you got to get on the road. I wanted to ask you just two more questions about two more characters.
Right, you're right. It's funny you should say that, because my wife just walked in the door, and I have to go pick up my daughter.
I know.
But go on.
No. I found an album in a thrift store a while back. An album by Buck Clark, the percussionist. And there you are on drums at a Jewish community center in Washington, D.C. The Sound of Buck Clark, it was called. And here's another, to me, it was a beautiful thing. Here you're bringing acoustic Black American music into the Jewish community center. To me, it spoke of a willingness, an open-mindedness, and a tolerance. It spoke to me of it was a very hip time, and I don't know if you even remember that particular session, because you've been on so many.
I'll never forget it. It was my first one.
Wow. Tell me about it.
He was in Washington, D.C. when I was a teenager. That was done when I was 17 years old or something.
You were so young.
Yeah, and he was a hand drummer, but he was also a great painter. You should see some of his paintings. Very innovative guy. And he ultimately ended up moving to California and playing in Freddie Hubbard's band and in Les McCann's band. And he made the record Sextant on Herbie's record with us.
Oh, I didn't know he would play percussion. That was the other thing is that would you equate Mongo Santa Maria as big a role model for black youth as guys like Muhammad Ali were at that time? Because it seemed to me like there were a lot more hand drums in the neighborhoods, and therefore you created these characters like Buck Clark or Ray Mantilla, or it didn't. I mean, they were proficient and they were congueros, and but you also know that Santeria. I mean, that's a religion, right?
A hand drumming religion, of which Mongo was a priest.
Right.
So of course it was a huge influence, and probably a griot of some sorts also.
One final comment from you. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the Soul Brothers from Philadelphia, the band Catalyst, Eddie Green, Sherman Ferguson. Those guys. You were on one of their albums, but just talk. I mean, those guys have left us now, and as far as I'm concerned,
as one guy is still around, because I just recorded with him.
Tyrone Brown, right?
Huh?
Who?
Odine Pope.
Odine Pope. I didn't mean to leave him out. I think about Sherman and I think about Eddie Green, and I say to myself, boy, we miss cats like that. I just, talk a little bit about them before we wrap it up.
Well, I can't even say that much about Sherman, because he was one of my best friends.
Wow.
So, and on that record, I think he wrote a song for me. Hold on a second. My wife is calling. Yes? I'm doing an interview. Did you need me for something? So yeah, Sherman he wrote a song called Jabali on one of those records, and I just recorded about 3 months ago with Odine Pope. I
haven't gotten to Odine yet, but I'll tell you.
Well, Odine. He played with Max Roach for 20 years.
I have gotten to Mantia, Warren Smith, and Joe Chambers is coming on the program as well. So I'll tell you.
Well, you mentioned two of my heroes. Warren Smith is like a mentor. He's one of the most brilliant, not just drummers, but one of the most brilliant percussionist musicians in the history of the instrument, in modern history anyway. I mean, I'm sure there was some guys 1,000 years ago that were great.
No,
or 500 years ago. But
I agree.
In today's world, Warren Smith is one of the icons of the instrument. I mean, beyond commercialism, period. I mean, he's just higher than that. And Joe Chambers also, those are, Joe Chambers was around Washington, D.C. when Eddie and myself were around during that time.
Well, I will wrap this up with a story that I visited Gil Goldstein this summer at his house in Long Island, and I love the album Exit with you and Richard Davis, who I've interviewed twice, and Pat Martino, who I've interviewed twice, and Gil, and Gil said, he goes, I was, he was such a young dude, he didn't know what was going on, and he was, a little uptight, but then on one of these songs, like Days of Wine and Roses, one of these songs, he ripped off a huge solo, and after it was done, he just said, Richard and Billy were so supportive, and you were just like, that's the real you, man. That's the real you. And I think that the more that our society can develop leaders like Billy Hart, people that can look inside someone, make them feel more secure instead of picking them up rather than stepping on them, maybe we still have hope. So thank you so much, brother, for this interview.
All right. Well, thank you for caring. You're a big inspiration. Thanks a lot.
I'll talk to you soon.
Remember, the highest form of intelligence in the universe is love.
Amen. Go to work, my friend. I'll talk to you soon.